We're recording on Wednesday morning. We are doing Race Class Episode 6. So let me just give you a heads up. We've been having this class once a month, race class, with Professor Jonathan Feingold. And we decided during the summer that we would double dip because there's just too much to cover. And there's so much happening, especially in light of some of the decisions that will be made by the United States Supreme Court. So rather than just having once a month, we're going to go twice a month. So this is one of our sort of double dipping in the month of June. And I would suspect that the way Jonathan wants to describe Episode 6 is Race Matters After Admissions, Why Equality Runs Through Diversity. So let me just remind you, if this is the first time you've been introduced to race class, how we got here. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and The Attitude with Arnie Arneson, a radio show that airs on the Pacific Network and on WNHNFM.org, are offering Race Class, a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. So, Jonathan, as I was looking at your outline for today, I saw an article about affirmative action on the chopping block. And I want to just read you one of the quotes that was in that article that I think sort of in some ways almost sets the stage for today's conversation about affirmative action. The default in our society hasn't been colorblindness. It has been discrimination. And that discrimination has not been cured yet. This is a fundamental reality that needs to be communicated to this court, whether or not they want to listen or will pay any attention. This was a quote by Dr. Gary Orfield, co-director of the UCLA Civil Rights Project. So welcome back to the program, Jonathan, and let's talk about the issues in today's conversation, because I think it's so important for us to understand why this affirmative action case that will be heard by the Supreme Court is important. And you've actually divided it up into three ways of looking at it. And in some ways, we're sort of backing into the conversation.
Yes to all of that. And thanks as always, Arnie, for having me. I'm thrilled that we've been able to um, double the number of our standard episodes over the summer. And so just to give everyone a little bit sort of broader overview of where we're headed, this summer in June, July, and August, we're going to do a six-part series on affirmative action. Why affirmative action? In part because, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court is poised to prohibit all schools, whether public or private schools being universities, from considering a student's race as part of the application process. Now, that's coming down the road. One of the things that's, often frustrated me is that we have a pretty stale affirmative action conversation in this country. And it's stale in part because so much of the focus is on the affirmative action policy, which means that we're never spending time asking how race matters before affirmative action arrived. So these are all universities that at one time didn't have an affirmative action policy, and many that, given the Supreme Court, likely won't have an affirmative action policy. So the question that we grapple with in race class is, how does race matter? And here we're asking, how does it matter when you're not consciously, formally accounting for an applicant's race? And we've divided that conversation into essentially three parts. So in June, we're going to be talking about how race matters after admissions, which is the question of on college campuses, how does race matter? In a couple weeks, we have a special guest who I'm thrilled to come on, Dr. Evelyn Carter, who's just going to enable us to dive deeper. Then in July, we're going to have two episodes on how race matters during admissions. But again, how race matters even when we're not actively, intentionally accounting for race. And then in August, we'll close up with two episodes on how race matters before admissions. And so, we're sort of backing in, maybe doing it in the reverse, but a six-part series on affirmative action where the question is, how does race matter before affirmative action arrives? And the reason why I think it's a really important way to have the conversation is because what we'll see over the course of these six episodes is there are countless ways in which race is operating, some ways that are easy to see, other ways that are a lot harder. And almost always, those somewhat invisible ways that race operates extends what we might think of as a racial advantage to students who identify as white. And so what that actually means is that through affirmative action, we're actually making college admissions more race neutral. Or put differently, affirmative action is necessary in order to reduce the relevance of race in the admissions process. So that's where we're headed. Today is our first look at how race matters after admissions. And as you said, I think the key is all about understanding diversity as a propeller of equality.
So can I just stop you really there? Because since we're starting at the after, let me just give you a little vignette. So my father was in the military, and my father said it was one of the best things that ever happened to him. Can I tell you why? He was a Norwegian from Brooklyn in Bay Ridge, where there were more Norwegians in Bay Ridge than in Oslo, Norway. So you can imagine everybody had blonde hair and blue eyes, and was named Sven. Okay, so this is my father. And my father goes into the military, and he said the best thing about being in the military was that the guy beneath him was from Alabama. The guy next to him was from Georgia. The guy over on the other side of the room was from Montana. They were black. They were Chinese. They were whatever. And there was this mixture of America that he never would have known, because he would have been in this cocoon of Bay Ridge that was little Oslo. And that was his knowledge of the world. And what happened as a result of the fact that he was in the United States military was that suddenly he got to experience America. America. And he didn't see that as a negative. He saw that as kind of like a smorgasbord and something incredibly wonderful. So as you've been talking about affirmative action and after, I keep thinking about how foolish can we be? My father was actually embracing affirmative action, only he didn't know that that's what he was doing. Because he would have, if asked, he would have opposed it. And yet look what he celebrated when he served in the United States military.
So that's such a helpful vignette to get us into the conversation for two reasons. One is what you're sort of describing there is one of the benefits of diversity being exposure to different people with different experiences, which is not actually the aspect of diversity that I'm going to have us focus on today. But the point being that diversity has a whole lot of benefits. One is exposure to different viewpoints, a multiplicity of perspectives in the classroom where ideas can flow and germinate. But today we're going to talk about something a little bit different that I think gets less airtime, but deserves more attention as we're having these conversations about affirmative action. And so to start, I'm going to ask, we're going to run this little hypo. And so Arnie, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and follow along. And anyone listening, feel free to do the same. So Arnie, imagine you are a Yankees fan. So New York Yankees. Now, for some folks, that's going to be easy. For others, it might feel sacrilegious. It's okay. It's just an exercise. But imagine you're a Yankees fan. Mm-hmm. It's September. Playoffs are here. And the Yankees happen to be playing my beloved Red Sox in the American League Championship Series. And a footnote, I apologize for anyone who's listening who's not a baseball fan. But we're going to stick with this hypo for now. Now, turns out you're traveling for work. The radio show has brought you there. You think you have a meeting, but it got canceled right when game one of the ALCS is supposed to start. So you're just thrilled. Like you thought you were going to have to follow along on your phone during while you're actually recording the episode, but no, you get to go to a bar, sit down, watch the game. So what do? You pull out your phone, you just search, and you find a bar down the street. You put on your Yankees hat, put on your Yankees shirt, walk down, go in, get up to the bar, just find a nice spot, order your drink. They bring it to you. You take a sip and you breathe. And you are just so excited and so thrilled that you're going to get to enjoy the game. That's the first opportunity you have to sort of get a sense of where you are. So you look to your left and you look to your right and you realize that there's actually Red Sox fans sitting on either sides of you at the bar, and it's LA, so people are in tank tops. And so one of these guys has this big Red Sox tattoo on his upper arm. But then you keep looking around the room and you realize that it's not just these two people, that everyone in this crowded bar is clearly a Red Sox fan, wearing their Red Sox shirts, their Red Sox hats. You also look at the walls and you see Red Sox paraphernalia, banners, signs, pictures. Everything in that space signals to you quite clearly that you are not in Yankee land anymore. It actually turns out that you're at Sonny McLean's, which is one of the biggest Red Sox bars on the West Coast, one of my personal favorites. That's where you are. And so Arnie, how do you feel? What are you thinking about?
I'm chilled. I'm thinking, okay, so when the Yankees hit it out of the park, I'm gonna go, oh, that was a nice hit, you know. And you can't emote, you can't get excited because you're feeling like everybody would notice you. You are feeling your difference. You don't feeling your relationship, and you're gonna even think about, can I enjoy this game when I'm gonna feel so stifled?
Yeah, so you are super self-conscious about the fact that you are a Yankees fan, one.
Right.
You know that everyone knows you're a Yankees fan, two. And you know you're in a place where Yankees fans are like maybe not even welcome there simply because of one, the composition of Yankee fan to Red Sox fan, and the whole history we know about, antagonism potentially between Red Sox fans and Yankee fans. So let me pull out three key concepts, and then we'll transition into, well, what does this have to do with, diversity on college campuses? So first, we have many different aspects of our identity. It could be a sports affinity, it could be our age, it could be our gender, religion, race. And of course, they often interact. Now, you entering that bar as a Yankees fan who's a woman might be different than a friend of mine who's a Yankees fan and a man. Like just that sort of gender sports affinity intersection could alter how you experience it. But the basic point is we have a lot of different aspects to our identity, and oftentimes parts of many of our identities we're not really thinking about. We're most likely to be consciously thinking about them when we are visibly marked as an outsider
Right.
in a particular space. And that just brings us into, the second key element, that environments matter. Like, why is it that you became self-conscious about that Yankee identity? It's because the environment signaled to you that this was a place for Red Sox fans, not Yankees fans. The people there, the images on the wall, everything signaled to you who is an insider in that space and who is an outsider.
And the word that comes into my head is you don't belong.
Yeah,
You don't belong. All right, keep going.
no, but exactly right. And then, this combination of an identity being salient because of the environment can have severe consequences if you are that underrepresented. One is you're just hyper vigilant of everything that you do. You're worried about whether you'll be treated differently, whether or not you'll be valued. Um, and it's going to be a significant mental tax. You can't be yourself. You can't just focus. You're constantly having to be on guard. And so, a basic way to think about it is because of all these factors, you can't just enjoy the game in the same way that everyone else in that bar is going to be able to enjoy the game. So now let's pivot to university campus. I don't know, anyone who's listening, just think of, some university that we could think about Harvard or UNC because those are the two schools that are defending their existing admissions policies before the Supreme Court. And there's going to be a lot of conversation about why racial diversity matters. One reason why it matters is that when you have campuses that are racially diverse, it's going to buffer students of color who would otherwise be severely underrepresented from all of what we've just been talking about.
You're not
But
alone.
but you translate the context of that Yankees Red Sox bar to a college campus, and when it's not just that you might be marked as an outsider, but you're having to contend with centuries, at least decades, if not centuries, of social societal stereotypes that lead us to associate certain groups with academia and others not, and stereotypes that have to do with intellectual ability, among other things. And so that means that if certain students find themselves severely underrepresented on college campuses, it's going to deny them the benefits that flow from being a member of that community. Another way to think about it is that if white students are overrepresented on college campuses, that essentially functions as a racial preference for those white students, even if it's not something we intend to do or mean to do. And so then I just want to take, a couple minutes thinking about what are the stakes. Because if racial diversity, if one of its core functions is to promote the personal and present, like right now, in the moment equality interests of each student, like what is at stake? And there's at least three general sort of buckets of benefit that comes from university membership that are at stake. One is learning, the second is networking, and the third is signaling. And I'm going to, run through this really quickly, but I do think it's worth pausing. Just think about, well, what is at stake? What if our institutional environments are not created in a way because of the composition of the student body where everyone can, get what they're supposed to get out of that experience? So learning, pretty self-explanatory. One reason we go to college, whether it's UMass Lowell, whether it's UNC, whether it's Harvard, is to learn skills that are going to help us, professionally in other aspects of our life. Really significant problem from an institutional perspective if aspects of that, university environment are taxing certain students in a way where they're just not able to learn because they're having to confront all of these, maybe invisible forces that other students don't have to confront. Just a huge problem. So that's learning. The second is networking. So, but I think, it's hard not to recognize that anyone who holds a position of power in this country got it not because they had some unique talent or quote unquote merit, but because who you know and who invests in you. And so again, we have a significant problem if institutional environments are creating conditions in which some people have access to building those relationships than others.
Let me just stop you here. Again, I'm
Yeah.
going to go to a vignette. I'm in the ladies' room at the New Hampshire legislature, very late in my career. And I walk into the ladies' room, and all of a sudden I see a chairman of one committee, a chairperson of another committee, the majority whip. And I'm looking in the room. This is a ladies' room. And I went, oh my God, there's been a brain drain on the floor of the New Hampshire House. Because for the first time ever, I saw the networking and the power, not in the boys' room, okay, but in the girls' room. And for me, it was like a light bulb moment because it was so unusual. And it had not happened before the way that I could actually visually see it. And that networking you're describing, for the first time ever, I saw a networking that could occur, but it wasn't occurring in the boys' bathroom, which it always had occurred. It wasn't occurring at the boys' poker game, which always happened on Wednesday night. Suddenly there was another sort of element there. And that's because women were attaining more power, more opportunity, and there was quote unquote diversity within leadership. So again, as you're talking about that networking, I'll never forget that moment in the ladies' room in the New Hampshire State House. But that is another example of what is denied if that doesn't happen.
Right. And diversity is the term that we often use, but in a certain way, like you're saying, really what we're talking about is representation.
Yes.
And having such a number that an individual who's part of a socially salient group is not clearly marked as an outsider, but actually, is part of a contingent in whatever space that is. So the final of the three sort of benefits that accrue from university membership is what academics maybe and I refer to as signaling, but essentially means the information that is communicated from a given proxy. And I'll give you an example that'll make it more clear. So imagine, siblings, one of whom goes to UMass Lowell, which is, one of the most important schools in Massachusetts where I am as a function of social mobility and other things. And the other sibling goes to Harvard. Now, from the perspective of an employer, whether your degree says UMass Lowell or Harvard signals something quite powerful about, whether you, are smart. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons why that's problematic, but just descriptively, it's true that the degree on your resume signals something to an employer about whether or not they want to hire you. That is a inter-university comparison. What we're really focused on here, though, is intra-university. So within a university, how might signaling affect what a future employer thinks? And here we can think about it with respect to GPA. So now again, imagine you have two students, but let's say they're both at Harvard. One graduates with a 3.7 and the other graduates with a 3.4. Employers are busy, so they're just trying to sort students, and the 3.7 looks, I don't know, better than 3.4. Now, for all sorts of reasons, it's likely that at least a portion of that gap is illusory. By what I mean is that it actually is not measuring some difference in the student's preparation or motivation, or I don't know, intrinsic smarts, to the extent that's even a thing. But it's likely due to a number of a product of an institutional environment that's taxing certain students in a way that it's not taxing others, which can arise when someone is severely underrepresented, which is just a long-winded way of saying that those two students might actually be identical in all regards, except that one, when they went through their 4 years at Harvard, had to deal with the tax of being severely underrepresented, which functioned as a headwind. The other was part of a group that was overrepresented, functions as a tailwind. And so again, we can sort of take
So
all.
is signaling also then you're also sort of signaling something to a sort of a stereotype that the professor might sort of feel comfortable with. So he's more comfortable with white male students, or less comfortable with women students or students of color. Because I remember going to St. Olaf College where I was the only New Yorker in my class and everybody was blonde and blue-eyed. And I remember my professor giving me a low grade because he didn't like the conclusion I had given on a paper. And it turns out that the conclusion I'd given on the paper was actually the conclusion of this, like, ultimately board that came up with the exact same conclusion. And I kept thinking, did he not like my conclusion, or did he make was there certain signaling going on about this brunette, brown-haired woman from New York compared to all the sort of ethnically Midwestern Scandinavians in my class? So, I mean, it's not just black, white. It's not just, gender. I mean, there are so many signals that happen. And sometimes, the difference, as you point out, between 3.4 and 3.7 may not be an academic rationale, but it could be based on sort of the signaling that is even going from the professor to the student.
So all really interesting things you brought up. And one, so of course, none of what we're talking about is just black or black and white, but it's so complicated, and we never have an opportunity to get into all of it here. But of course, it's complex. But something that you mentioned that I want to engage a little bit. So you talked about how you receive negative comments from a professor. Now, if you were part of a majority group, you would never even ask the question, was that negative evaluation because of my identity?
Yes, exactly.
You would never have to go run through those mental cycles of just being, is this an instance in which I was discriminated against because I'm an outsider, because the professor, has low expectations about people from my group, because the professor actually holds some, soft animosity towards people from my group. And that's part of the tax. When you are a majority group, when you're a group that is not confronting a negative stereotype in the domain, you never have to ask, you never have to consider whether the negative treatment was because of your identity. Wow. And that, it's really taxing. So we only have 3 minutes. And so I'm going to jump into a little bit of the science because I think it further helps to sort of unpack the relationship between environments and identity and stereotypes, which is a lot of what's happening here. There's this psychological phenomena called stereotype threat, which I think we've referenced on the show before. And it's the psychological threat that arises when someone worries that their negative performance will confirm a negative stereotype about their group. And what we know is that this psychological phenomenon is not limited to any particular group of people. What matters is that you belong to a group. That group suffers a negative or is negatively stereotyped in a particular domain, and that aspect of your identity is salient. And so we'll finish with another little hypothetical. So Arnie, imagine that you are you. I don't know. Are you a Yankees fan or not a Yankees fan?
I think Mets.
Okay, Mets. Okay, Mets fan. All right, but you are you. And now imagine that, you decided to make a professional shift, and you join this new tech firm that opened up in like Concord, New Hampshire.
Hmm.
And it's a tech firm that, it's all 20-year-olds. And my guess is that your age is something that you would be pretty aware of,
Yeah.
just given that, and people can't see us, but
I'm 68, everyone. So he's sort of channeling that information. Gray hair. Keep going.
so 68-year-old Arnie, 20-year-old firm. Also, there's a number of negative stereotypes that are attached to the elderly. Not necessarily, many cases, not true, but they're socially salient, and we might actually think that they're going to be most um, expressly held by folks in their 20s. And so, an environment that makes your age identity salient and where there's negative stereotypes about the elderly. Now, let's say you play as a group, like get to know you game. Everyone does it together in this sort of public setting, and the game is presented as a memory task exercise.
Right.
So that specific stereotype that has to do with the elderly and bad memory is on everyone's mind. You know that if you mess up, or at least you have a suspicion that if you mess up, they're going to say, oh, it's because it's because she's
68.
old, because she's 68. Not because, I don't know, she had a bad day or she's tired or she
Gotcha.
wasn't like paying attention. And the fear of confirming that stereotype is going to be a mental tax, a cognitive burden that actually undermines your ability to perform, where it wouldn't be if the same exercise had been presented as a problem solving
We need an
activity.
hour. Race Class, Episode 6. Race Matters After Admissions, Why Equality Runs Through Diversity. We've been chatting with University of Law Professor Jonathan Feingold. Thank you so much. You're making so much clearer, and you're connecting dots in ways that we need to understand, because when we're talking about things like affirmative action, we need to understand how textured the conversation is. So thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.